circular saws. No, I didn't say a skill saw. This might be a skill saw, and this might be a skill saw, but that's it. The rest of them are all different name brands and makes. So they are all considered a circular saw. That don't mean that they can cut circles. That just means that they have a circular disc on it. That's why they're called a circular saw. Always use eye protection when you're using any saw whatsoever. By using eye protection and following the manufacturer's recommendations on how to use these tools will greatly reduce injury. Anytime that you make any adjustment on any of the saws, make sure to de-energize it first. That way no one gets hurt. Even on the battery operated ones. Before any adjustment is made, make sure that you de-energize it. Circular saws come in all shapes and sizes by about every manufacturer that you could possibly think of. Even specialty saws like this one. And today I'm going to talk about each one of these saws, especially the granddaddy of them all. Since circular saws are sometimes called a skill saw, we'll start off with the skill saw. The skill saw was one of the first to come around, and it is a skill saw. That's the brand name of it. It has a spring retractable guard on it. It has a mechanism so that you can tilt it. It has a mechanism that you can raise and lower the foot on it. And of course, it has a trigger. This particular one has a trigger that has a safety on it. So you have to push this with your thumb before you can start the motor. This one even comes with a little flashlight. Some of them give you a little guide so that you can use this to determine what depth of cut you are with your blade. This is not always accurate because the blades may be a different size. This is a DeWalt circular saw. It is probably heavier duty than the skill saw that I just showed you. It also has a spring retractable guard on it. It has an aluminum plate. It also has the adjustment on it for doing angles. And it has the one so that you can do the depth as well. The DeWalt comes with a little tool that you can use to take off the blade, and even a blade lock, so that when you push this in, this does not turn and you can take off the blade. I'll talk about that in a minute. A lot of the different vendors also offer a right hand and a left hand saw. Basically, for a person who is right-handed, this would be the saw for you. And if you're left-handed, this would be the saw for you. All of them still have pretty much the same type of features on them. A tilt, a foot depth gauge, a blade lock. The one thing that I like about this Porta-Cable here is I don't need a tool to change the blade. All I do is slide this, lock the blade, and then I don't have to have a tool to remove the blade. That's a pretty nifty little thing to have to change the blades. The one thing I also like about this is you can't get this thing too tight because it's so small. And the reason that I say that is if with these you have your wrench, and they generally, when you lock the blade, you push it, you loosen it in the direction that the blade is going. So the blade circulates in this direction. So I just push down my little lock and I take the bolt off. And what I really wanted to talk about was this clutch here. So if you'll notice, I can spin the blade without spinning the arbor. And this is an arbor driven saw, all right? So this is what saves you. By putting this on there and tightening onto the clutch, then if I were to hit a nail or if I were to hit a knot or something, then the blade would stop and the arbor would continue to go. So when you put these on, you don't want to over tighten them at all. You want, if it slips a little bit when you're doing regular cutting, then you want to tighten it up a little bit more. But you don't want to put the oh my God on it so that if you hit a nail, it's going to cut the nail in two. You would rather save your blade, save your eyes, save your body, and have the blade stop and the engine continue going. Notice that all of them have two handles, and they are made to be used with two hands. So when you're trying to cut your stock, you should always use clamps to hold that down. A couple other features that each saws has is they have these little notches on here, and you'll find that these notches line up with either the outside or the inside of the blade, not both. You have to be real careful and know which one they line up with, and sometimes they don't line up with either, and you have to ignore that when you're sawing and watch your blade, not the notch. The Milwaukee saw has an extra little feature on here called a handle rotation. So by releasing this, I can pull the handle down from this low angle up to a high angle. Isn't that pretty cool? This circular saw has a little attachment here that goes on to a regular circular saw that you buy from Makita. This is a Makita part that goes on a Makita machine. And basically what this does is it captures dust. So you can use this for cutting fiber cement siding, or hardy board as it's sometimes called. And we also use a different blade on here as well. This blade is a diamond tip blade, and it will cut through that fiber cement siding much better and cleaner than a regular blade. Like I said before, this is an arbor driven saw, so that means the blade runs off of the arbor of the engine. So the engine is this manner, and there's actually a small transmission in here that will speed this up just a little bit so that the engine doesn't have to go at full RPMs for this to turn. But other types of saws, such as this worm drive saw, they change the direction of the engine is running in this direction, and then you have a worm drive that changes the direction so that you get this spin on here. Now what good is this over the arbor driven saw? Generally these saws are bigger engines, and because of the worm drive, this has a lot more torque than the arbor driven saw. So this could be used to cut larger stuff, harder stuff. This one here is just for your typical plywood 2x material here. This Bosch has a couple of little features that I really like on it. One, it has this little joist hook on it, so that if you're up on the roof framing, then you can actually hook it onto the joists or the rafters, and it's not going to get away from you. The other little feature that I like about this is this little thing right here. It takes a drop cord instead of having its own cord. So basically what we can do, you can slide that through there, hook that, and then when we plug it in here, upside down, now it is ready for service. When I'm done, I don't have a cord that I have to wrap around this machine to put it up. And what happens when you wrap those cords too many times, is they start getting frayed like we've done on this skill saw. This cute little saw is what I consider a trim saw. It is battery powered. In this case, it's a 12 volt max DeWalt circular saw. It has a safety on there to keep you so that you don't pull it by accident. But it has a nice little blade that will do somewhat work. It will not cut through an entire piece of plywood from one side to the other without the battery draining down. And it probably won't do you a whole lot of cuts on a 2x4, but for a trim piece, this would be great. It has the same features as all of the other ones do, but it's in a compact little circular saw type fashion here that uses a battery. Now let's talk about the granddaddy of them all. This is a 16 5/16 circular saw. In comparison to the 7 1/4 inch regular circular saw, this thing is a beast. This has the same features as its smaller cousin, but they're just bigger. Look at the size of that blade. Is that something? All of the features of the guard, the angle, and the depth are all the same. This is just made for a larger cut, such a beam. Because the blade is so large, it can allow that blade to kind of fish through a piece of wood, especially if it's a hardwood. So they give you a little feature here called a blade stabilizer. So basically you turn that and it stays in and it kind of pushes on the blade a little bit. Ours is a little worn out, but it just gives it enough room so that blade doesn't fishtail through a piece of wood. Now let's talk about the blades that they use. A regular blade, circular saw blade, can come in many different tooth ranges. 18 tooth, I believe this might be a 32 tooth, to a 40 tooth. And you can see from a 40 to an 18, there's quite a bit of difference. This is made for construction, for cutting rough lumber. This might be for cutting harder lumber for a smoother cut. Years ago, they just made blades out of steel and sharpened the ends and gave them a kerf. So what do I mean by a kerf? That means that the blades would have been separated in such a fashion, and you can kind of see that. One blade is folded in the left direction while the next blade is folded in the right direction. And this was just cut from a single piece of steel. Later, they started putting a tungsten carbide tip on here, which is very, very strong, much stronger than the metal around it. This can cut through a nail or a harder piece of wood or even a knot. This is a specialty blade. It's made with only 4 teeth on it. This is used to cut fiber cement siding. In my opinion, it doesn't do a very good job because it will fishtail once it gets hot. The diamond tip blade is made for cutting block and brick. So why wouldn't we use it to cut a cement board? It also has a key in here. Some saws come with a little key on there that allows it to not slip. In my opinion, that's not very good. Always use one that has a clutch on it that will allow slippage to keep you safe from harm. Now let's talk about safety devices and safety in general when using these tools. Always check your cord, and you can't always do that visually. Literally take your finger and run down this cord, feeling for any abnormalities that might be in the cord. This, when you're looking at it, you're only seeing an outside insulation sheathing across it. But if you feel something inside of it, that wire might be broke. Another good feature that comes on all saws today is the guard. All right, make sure that your guard works properly. It should snap back very, very fast to protect you from this open blade here. Make sure that if you ever use this to cut concrete products, that you clean it out. Take a blower and blow all this out so you get all of this out and that works properly. Never, ever, ever tie this down. Okay, when this thing is going, if you're going to set it down on the ground, bam, it's going to take off and it's going to ruin the blade, it's going to ruin the ground, it's going to ruin whatever table you might have on there. So make sure that this guide works properly. And before you set it down, make a note to look at this to make sure that it has popped back down. When you go to set the depth of your blade, you'll notice that we have the tip of the blade and then we have this gullet that is up here. So that gullet, it allows material to be drug out of the material and cleans it for the next cut. So when you're setting this depth, really the bottom of that gullet is the only thing that needs to protrude out from the bottom of your material being cut. Also, make sure you're aware of what's under here. You don't want to be cutting your table, you don't want to be cutting your fingers, you don't want to be cutting any metal or anything that might be below this to support it. So you might have to pull it off of your sawhorse or raise it up if you're on a table just by a couple of pieces of 2x4 to bring that up so that you're not cutting it. You don't need to have this at all the way down. That's just way too much blade sticking out. That could cause injury if you're not paying close attention. Another thing that I like to do is when you're operating this machine, you've got both hands on there, okay? So always make sure that you clamp your work down so that it doesn't work. But another thing that I do is a lot of people use their index finger to run the trigger. Well, I like to use my middle finger. That way I have this finger out here and my thumb here, which helps me guide the saw better and have a little bit more leverage so that I can move it if I need to. Most all circular saws will give you an option of having a rip guide. And what a rip guide does is it attaches to your base and you can set it to whatever distance you need from the blade to the rip guide. And then when you're cutting, raise this up a little bit, so that when you're cutting, all of your pieces all the way down the length of that board is going to be identically the same thickness all the way down. Another thing when I talk about shop safety is clamp your board down, because if I've got one hand on here and I'm trying to push through this thing, it tends to want to do this number. And you know, if you've not got a good handhold on this because the blade is going in this direction, it's going to have a tendency to come back at you really fast, and you don't want that to happen. So always make sure that you clamp your work down before using it. And I like to use 2 clamps, that way it doesn't try to spin on me. Always keep 2 hands on it when you're running this saw. The saw is going in this direction and it will tend to want to jump back at you if you're not paying attention. Also, make sure that your saw is going at no load RPMs before it touches any wood. Never allow it to touch the wood before you pull the trigger. When I say no load, that means that there's nothing on it and I've pulled the trigger and it goes to full RPMs. Another great feature on circular saws is an electric brake. Let me explain. This one does not have an electric brake on it, and you'll notice how long it took for it to stop. Now let's try one that does have an electric brake. Notice how fast it stops? This is a good feature to have. Whenever you're using these saws, make sure that your cord is not up under it. If you have to, take your cord and hold it in your hand while you use the machine to keep it out of the way of the blade. Even though there is a guard here and the guard works properly, there's an area right there that if the blade gets hit, it's going to cut it. Another type of circular saw is called a compound miter saw. A compound miter means that it can go this way, this way, and you can do a compound miter. This is a sliding compound miter, meaning that it will turn, it will bevel, and it also slides so that I can get the maximum cut on them. This also has a lot of features that you need to be aware of. Number one, when you move this from side to side, make sure that you're pushing down on this little knob here so that you don't go. Because this little circle here is held into place by screws and it has some adjustment on it, by slamming it back and forth here and hitting these little stops in here, then you'd stand a chance of throwing it out of accuracy. And that is big time when you're working in construction. Accuracy means everything. So this will go 60 degrees in this direction and 50 degrees in this direction, as long as we don't have something in the way. And there are certain stops along the way, such as 15 degrees, 0 degrees, 15 degrees, 30, 31.6 degrees, and 45. If you're not falling into one of these stop notches, you can push this handle down and it will keep it from moving. This also will lock in a lockdown position. By pulling this little pin, notice that I'm pushing down, pulling the pin, and then releasing it allows it to come up. By pushing it all the way down, pushing in the pin, and letting off, it stops it. And that way it is safer. Notice that it also has a guide on it as well. And this guide is to protect you. One thing that you can be sure of, when you're cutting wood, you can, number one, you can put it down to the wood, look at it, bring it back off of the wood and start it. Remember, no load RPMs. Slow and steady into it, let the saw do the work. You can also look through the fin here. And by looking through that fin, you can see the edge of the blade and where your mark is down here on the wood. Another feature that this has is it has a pop-down lock so that you can cut to a certain depth without going all the way. This is fully adjustable. These little wings on the side of it allow for you to get maximum bevel when you're cutting. This is what we consider a bevel. This is what we consider a miter. When we bevel this, it is important to pull these little wings back, or otherwise, when you're trying to saw it, they can very much get in the way. As you can see, somebody has already done that. Why are those wings important? Those wings are important because if you have a large piece of wood that you're putting up in this direction, and when this blade hits it because it's going in that direction, if this were back, then it can fold this in and ruin your whole work. There's also features here on the side that you can pop down and allow to get different angles without having to change the whole thing. There's a scale on this, and there's a scale on the front. This little mechanism here locks the slide down so that you can move this from job site to job site. But you also have an adjustment here that allows this not to move. It's always best to have it in the closed position when not in use. This particular model has a nice little light on it as well.